Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Aparutade sangamatassa tawara ye sodavanta bamunchantu satang. So this afternoon reflect on the auspicious event of Asala Puja. This is one of the major celebration festival days in the Theravada tradition. And this is celebrated because the Buddha, after his enlightenment, gave his first sermon to his 5 friends, colleagues, and it's very interesting to contemplate the first sermon, which is a sermon I've used as my reference point throughout my monastic life, from the time I was a Samanera to this present moment. I find this Four Noble Truths teaching, as we have it at this time, as a perfect kind of teaching, because it includes everything and it's simply expounded, where sometimes religion can sound very complicated. When you look at all the commentaries, the suttas, the scriptures, both the Pali Canon or the Mahayana scriptures or Tibetan scriptures, are enormous. So this, when I first ordained as a Samanera, felt very intimidated by the complexity that I felt when I looked at the outward form of Buddhism. It looked like something that would take years to master and read all these scriptures and be able to understand them and use them for practice. So when I was Samanera, this was before I met Luang Por Cha, I was advised by another monk to just take the Four Noble Truths in an edition from Sri Lanka called The Word of the Buddha, composed by a German bhikkhu called Jnanati Loka. So I've used that as a Samanera. And I secluded myself in a kuti, in a monastery in Nong Khai province in northeast Thailand. And I was advised not to take any other literature with me, to just read, if you're going to read this Word of the Buddha. So I thought this might be an interesting experience, because I was well educated and liked to read, and spending a year alone just with this one little pamphlet, really, it seemed like a real challenge, and it was, but it produced a good result. Now this teaching of the Four Noble Truths, according to the suttas, the Buddha, when he was enlightened, he wasn't enlightened till he was a Buddha, so he was an ascetic Gautama. He'd been a prince, a royal prince. He'd experienced all the advantages of high status, being brought up in wonderful surroundings, palaces and titles, etc. Then he spent 6 years as an ascetic, denying himself all kinds of things and developing concentration. But these two extremes of sensory indulgence, privilege, and its opposite, the denial of all these titles, privileges, and sensory pleasures, still led to feeling that there was something missing, because the sense of still being a person trying to conquer evil or to restrain from sensory pleasures or one's ego gets stuck on these kind of identities, being a samana, being a prince, whatever they might be, from the highest to the lowest. And what the ascetic Gautama realized during his ascetic years, that these two extremes created delusions about oneself. They're operating from privilege, titles, luxuries, to denial of those very same conditions. So this led to leaving his 5 friends, going off by himself sitting under a Bodhi tree, and then realizing the true nature, the ultimate reality of Dhamma. So this word Dhamma is the word we use for absolute or ultimate reality. But what is it? What is, when you try to conceive or define or imagine ultimate reality, I used to challenge myself to try to imagine what ultimate reality would be. Would it be like returning to the palace and living happily ever after in a state of happiness? Or is it like oblivion or just denial? These are the extremes. And so the Buddha propounded a way called the middle way. Neither sensory indulgence nor in ascetic torture practices. So what does this mean in terms of our lives in modern-day United Kingdom? How do we apply the Four Noble Truths to our lives as we live a life both experiencing sensory delights and pleasures, and we also have to experience suffering, the loss of friends, parents, relatives, poverty, disease, old age. And so this is in the negative side. Because the body is basically, the human form is basically an unsatisfactory form. When we operate always from the personal identity with the human form that we believe we are, then we're going to suffer. So the first noble truth the Buddha expounded is the most obvious truth available to any human being, stating the first noble truth is there is suffering. Now this is not complicated or abstract because it's quite obvious. We all suffer from childhood to old age, to death. Life is, we can have sensory pleasures and experiences, through the body, but they're very impermanent, uncertain, and dependent on other conditions. So what did the ascetic Gautama realize? That he claimed to be a Buddha. A Buddha is awakened to Dhamma, absolute reality, ultimate truth, or these words are the best we can find in the English language. So the Buddha said there is suffering, it should be understood. So this means not to see it in a personal way, like I'm suffering because of abuse in the past, or because I've got a disease, or something wrong with me, or it's somebody's fault, because those are all egotistical attitudes. When in the Western world, where I was conditioned in the American style, was that suffering, you should be happy. Life is an experience of happiness. This was the 1940s, 1950s Hollywood style of American views. And so this was the conditioning I received in my early life, that life should be a happy experience. And if you suffer, it's somebody's fault or there's something wrong with you. So you either blame somebody else because other people can cause us unhappiness, or we blame ourselves thinking that we're neurotic or we're not normal, or we're have mental problems, psychological problems, and so all these ideas we have about ourselves, like I have psychological problems, or I want to find eternal happiness in this realm that we experience through the human form, we're going to be disappointed because it's impossible. Permanent happiness is an impossibility. And so the first noble truth is facing the fact, because there is suffering is a fact. It's not a belief, it's not something that you have to believe in or cling to, but to understand. So understanding is the advice that the Buddha advised his colleagues with, to understand suffering, and to understand suffering. It's not about trying to analyze why I suffer, who's to blame, but to really go inward. So the point of meditation is to go inward, not to seek answers about suffering is caused by external forces, but by just the way I think, the way I see myself as an imperfect form, because human forms are imperfect. Their very nature is to change. They're born, they grow up, they get old and die, and that's just the way things are. Those are the facts of life. And when we identify with these facts of life in a personal way, then we no matter how wonderful our youth or childhood might have been, as you go older and your senses start fading and you experience various physical problems, aging problems, emotional problems, then we think that who's to blame? I remember blaming God. Why didn't God create everything so we'd be permanently happy? And that's a good question to ask. If God is all loving and fair and just, why did He create the conditions for this unfairness, injustice, suffering that that all human beings experience in their lifetime? So in this first year as a samanera in Nong Khai, I suffered a lot, not because of the conditions, the conditions were very ascetic, but my suffering wasn't caused through any mistreatment or abuse from the monks, the nuns, the lay people that supported me at that time. Nobody to blame. But I would sit in my kuti for hours just feeling miserable, lonely, lost, and trying to get rid of it, trying to get samadhi, trying to find peace, wanting to conquer suffering through willpower, through just willful acts of concentration. And that I found was, being alone for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, was, I'd always had other ways of escaping loneliness or unhappiness as a lay person. But none of these were available in this monastery. So then trying to suppress my feelings, just a willful act of me trying to get something that I told was important, samadhi, I could suppress it for a while, but I couldn't do it in the willful act of ego for 7 days a week, for months on end. Suddenly, all kinds of unrecognized, repressed feelings started arising, spontaneous. I didn't seek them, wasn't cultivating negative thoughts, but I was 31 years old at the time, and I lived a life learning how to suppress suffering. So at the age of 31, and I was in a situation where all my attempts to suppress suffering, to escape it, to distract myself from unhappiness, loneliness, or fear, there were just this word of the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths. So I began to contemplate the First Noble Truth, as listed in this book, the Word of the Buddha. And so just that alone turned me inward, because it's what we call Upanayaka Dhamma, where you're not seeking intellectual answers or clever psychological explanations for your suffering or your sense of loneliness or selfishness, but you're going inward, you're looking inward. So the point is to look inward, to observe suffering as you experience it. So that's what mindfulness is, the ability, awareness. These words are not being aware of objects so much that we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or think or feel, but looking inward at the very feeling of loneliness is like this, or anger is like this, or fear is like this. So I found that quite liberating, because I never would have thought of that on my own. It was always suffering is caused from external conditions. But suddenly, there was there weren't any external conditions that I could really blame for my feelings. They just spontaneously arise, especially when you're limiting yourself to not be distracted by things, by objects. And so I learned to observe, be the witness. So this witness position is what we call mindfulness or awareness. We're witnessing the way it is as we experience it. It's like this. And this witnessing is not judging. It's not about labeling what you experience as good or bad, right or wrong, but just observing the fear, anger, repressed anger, jealousy, anxiety, worry, are what they are. They arise. And without having to create them, they just spontaneously appear in consciousness. What is aware of fear, of anxiety, of jealousy, of anger? You know, this awareness, is it personal? I'm suffering from who has an iPhone, that is. No, I'm just kidding, but the suffering then becomes a way, and the Buddha's teaching is all conditions are impermanent. So as I began to just witness suffering, rather than try to find happiness or get peace, I just learned to sit. I found walking meditation more difficult to witness, because in the sitting position I would actually feel, there was nothing to do. The body isn't acting in any way. And then the emotions, anger, fear, worry, anxiety, self-disparagement, all these conditions that we can claim as personal problems, see them in terms of very personal faults. That, a good person isn't jealous or angry or frightened. But through reflecting on fear, anxiety, worry, things that haunt everybody in modern life, with all the news of the day and the coming up, the elections in the United States and so forth, there's a lot of kind of negative media information we're getting about doom, destruction, death, decay, about the end of democracy, about authoritarianism, about all kinds of words that create us a sense of fear or anxiety or worry. But instead of trying to suppress this anxiety or worry or to justify it as a personal thing, the Buddha, the first refuge that we take, is a witness to anxiety or worry about the future. It's like this. And suddenly when you're not trying to see it and blame it on others or yourself, then you begin to see that it is impermanent, that you can't stay permanently angry or depressed or worried or frightened. Conditions arise where those experiences happen. Now, our real refuge is in Dhamma, and I've given many reflections on that, because that word is, for those of us who weren't born into Buddhist cultures or Buddhist families, we're quite willing to take it as a refuge. Dhamma, defined as absolute reality, But what is absolute reality? What is it? Is it some kind of mystical experience, some kind of esoteric thing that happens to spiritually oriented people, or what is a Dhamma? And of course, absolute reality sounds, the right thing to take refuge in. But then ask yourself, what is? Can you imagine absolute reality? Can you visualize absolute reality where there's no old age, sickness, or death? Where there's bliss, absolute perfection. And it's impossible to imagine, to find the words from the sense of a separate self, a personal identity with a physical form that you own. You believe you are this limited form. So the Buddha's teaching, the Four Noble Truths, is an investigation of this whole dilemma that we face as human beings. It's not a doctrinal teaching. He didn't expect his 5 friends that he gave this sermon to believe in Four Noble Truths. They're not about belief. You don't believe in suffering, or as a kind of depressed, personal, egotistical view, you can believe life is all misery and empty and meaningless, and then that's just thinking, applying negative words to your experience. But that's not absolute truth. Absolute truth is Dhamma, ultimate reality, absolute reality. So where is it? Where is the Dhamma at this moment? If we take refuge in Dhamma, what are we taking refuge in? In absolute reality. That sounds very inspiring. It's not wrong, but it's still words. Attempt to use English definitions for Dhamma, so we understand it's pretty good. Dhamma is good, basically perfect. But where is it and what is it? So this investigation of the Four Noble Truths is taking us to realize the causes of suffering, which is desire, clinging attachment to desire. And when you're observing your body and its sensory experiences, we experience life through the senses, the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body itself, the thinking mind. We experience life through forms, through objects, through sensory conditions, such as our own eyes and ears. So where is ultimate, absolute reality? Can you see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, touch it? Is it a super sense? Where is it and what is it? These are important questions to ask yourself, because the Four Noble Truths is an investigation into the present moment. It's not about practicing meditation in order to become enlightened in the future, because that's still very personal. Just the fact that people tend to think they're unenlightened, there's something that they need to get, something called enlightenment. And somebody that believes they are enlightened, that still can be a misunderstanding, overestimation of themselves as a person. So then the more humble approach is, well, I'm not enlightened. And that's a safe thing to believe in society, because when you go around telling everybody you're enlightened, they don't quite know how to react to that. So when the Buddha became the Buddha after his experience of enlightenment, the first person he met before he encountered his 5 colleagues was an ascetic who stopped him on the way to Sarnath in India because he was impressed by his demeanor, his kind of luminous stance and presence. And he said, "What have you discovered?" And the Buddha said, "I am the Almighty Buddha, perfectly enlightened." And the ascetic didn't know how to relate to that. That sounds, most of us would rather run away from somebody that said that, except some people believe anything. And but the Buddha didn't want just sycophants believing in him as some kind of special human being, but when he met his 5 colleagues in Sarnath, he gave the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. Now these 5 friends of the Buddha were very good at all the samadhi practices and concentration practices, psychic phenomena, according to the scriptures. They were all very gifted in suppressing things by concentrating on objects. But none of them realized suffering as a noble truth till they heard it from the Buddha. That there is suffering, it should be understood. And that's the direction. To understand something, you have to let go of it, observe it. If you're just hanging on to the view that I'm suffering because of somebody's fault or my own inadequacy, then you're clinging to the sense of what you're not, clinging to that you're an unenlightened personality that wants to get enlightened. So that's a vicious circle. When you're just meditating to improve yourself as a person, the whole challenge of the First Noble Truth is to become the witness to the way it is, that the body and its senses and sensory objects are impermanent. Then there's no kind of perfection, ultimate reality in the sensory world. It's forever changing. And it's not always changing for the better, it changes for the worse. But it's still change, whether it's improving or degenerating. Change is the very nature of the world that we believe in. It's our reality. What we call the real world is the experience of change. Because the forms that we identify with and cling to and criticize or boast about are, by their very nature, imperfect, unsatisfactory. And by clinging to the forms without investigation, it's not committing suicide or trying to deny anything, because that's another form of clinging. So in polite society, we might say, I'm not enlightened yet, I'm working at it. What does that sound like? My very nature is this imperfect personality that has negative emotions and problems, getting old, fear sickness, old age and death, anguish and despair. So the causes of suffering is clinging to desire. And in Pali, the word for desire is dhanha, and the English word desire oftentimes connotes a kind of sensual desire, like sexual desire, or desire for food, or greed, or something, an object of the senses. But desire, in terms of the Second Noble Truth, there is desire. It's a condition that arises and ceases. Kama dhanha, sensual desire, arises and ceases. Trying to hold on to just beautiful objects that you see, or just experience pleasurable sensory pleasures, they all come to an end. Beautiful flowers, beautiful one day, and the following day they're faded and not beautiful anymore. So we might fool ourselves with plastic flowers, which last forever, but plastic flowers don't have the same effect on most of us that the reality of real flowers have. So just noticing how ephemeral, mutable the experience of life is for the forms that we identify with. So is it a desire to no desire? Is it ego to see desire in personal ways, my sensory desires, my sexual desires, my greed for food, my greed for pleasant sounds and sights? For sensory pleasures, we see it personally, we can see it as something we should deny, blindfold ourselves, plug up our nose and put stoppers in our ears, earplugs, and on like that. We can try to stop the senses from functioning, but that's still based on the basic delusion that you are the body, the emotions, the memories that you experience in daily life. Then to reflect on the way it is, this realm that we experience through the body is a desire realm. The body, the male body, female body, they're all full of desires. That's their very nature. That this desire realm is like this. The senses, you can contemplate dead flowers as a practice to learn to accept dead flowers rather than desire fresh flowers. But the actual reality is dead flowers are not beautiful. And that's the way it is. And when we try to convince ourselves they are beautiful, we play games with our minds and go through all kinds of intellectual efforts to live up to some standard we adhere to, or we believe in, without really investigating experience. So whether it's beautiful or ugly, it is the way it is. Ugly things are like this. Beauty is like this. And in this way, this kind of reflection, we begin to observe that awareness itself, mindfulness, sati sampajanya in Pali, is non-judgmental. It's not saying anything about the quality of the condition you're looking at. It's not judging it. as good or bad or ugly or beautiful. But it's we who have formed views and opinions through our thinking process that define things as pleasant, unpleasant, beautiful, or ugly. So language, investigate the language that you speak, because it is a condition, a phenomena that was created, not by God, by Buddha or Dhamma or anything like that. It's not a kind of mystical, there's no kind of mystical language or special spiritually evolved language. We have in this tradition the Pali language, Sanskrit, ancient languages like that, which are very good attempts to explain reality or to point the way towards reality. But words are sankharas, or conditions. They're empty phenomena. Try looking at your body as an empty phenomenon, just to see what happens to your mind, because we place so much importance on how we look, our appearance. And if we see it for what it is, it's a phenomena. It's a phenomenon, it's a condition that is present here and now. But being aware of the body, like bodily awareness, we're being aware, what is aware of the body in the present moment when you're meditating? The sitting posture, or the walking posture, standing posture, lying down posture. What is aware of these 4 different postures that the body assumes during the day and night? Is mindfulness a condition? Is awareness a condition? Is sati, sampajanya, the Pali words, are they phenomenon that you can observe as objects? Can you observe mindfulness? See it or hear it, smell it, taste it, touch it? You can think it, is about all we can do. But mindfulness is here and now. So when you reflect on the causes of suffering, the desire to get rid of anger or depression or sexual desire or greed in any form is maybe very idealistic. You know, as a person, we want to be fearless and loving and spotless and stainless. These are lovely words for perfection, but it's impossible to find these as a person, because the very nature of suffering is the clinging to something that we actually are not at all. Clinging to an empty phenomenon. So I used to like to spend hours just reflecting on this body is empty. Because in terms of experience, it seems extremely real. Especially as you get older, it's very real. And so people, we're celebrating my 90th birthday in a few days, and that's the convention that there's nothing wrong with it. It's not bad, but it's the 90th birthday of a body that's an empty phenomenon and always has been. So how does that affect you when you hear these words? That you're not, if you believe you're especially spiritually advanced person, and maybe you are, you have longing for realizing ultimate reality is certainly a personal trait that is admirable, and that's why we're here. But can you really be a spiritual person all the time when you're observing just the daily life that you live in a monastery or outside a monastery? So the desire, tanha, is to be let go of desire, which doesn't mean annihilation of it. We can't annihilate it, because that's personal again. When you see yourself as a person, then you think, I'm a monk or a nun, I've got to get rid of desire. I've got to fight desire. I've got to challenge it and be somebody without, an ideal bhikkhu or Siladharis or someone that's without desires, has no sexual desires, they're not greedy for food. So we can kind of train ourselves into acting that way. But the real problem is that we still believe we're somebody, a physical form, that we're living a life that we idealize as something wonderful and spiritual and advanced. But these are all concepts, ideas. Spiritual is another word. It has a beginning and end. I'm an spiritually advanced person. Those are words that are not denying it, but it is something that arises and ceases. Most of the time one has to live in daily life with hunger, heat and cold, pleasure and pain, living with other people, create all kinds of emotional reactions of like and dislike, love and hate. Being a separate person always means that you are separate from me, and that makes my relationship to you this kind of, if you agree with me, then we're friends. If you challenge me, we're enemies. I like you, I don't like you. And that's personal. And we create these likes and dislikes with the idea that we are a separate individual person from somebody else. But when we see here in this temple, at this time, all empty phenomena sitting here, what's there to hate or like or dislike? It's like this. Suddenly there's a sense of unity, of universality, because we're not dwelling on things with personal preferences or conditioning, but through wisdom. So letting go of desire to become enlightened, or to get something you don't have. So we imagine enlightenment is certainly a desirable word, to be enlightened like Gautama the Buddha, to be able to sit like a Buddha Rupa for hours on end while the world has its problems surrounding you, and you sit in bliss while the world carries on with its delusions, is kind of a fantasy. But Bhava Tanha is toward idealism, towards trying to get rid of the bad, the gross, the ugly, the mean, the selfish, the nastiness of life, and become some ideal of human perfection. But when you recognize that the world is about right and wrong, good and bad, it's the earth, fire, water, and air elements in space. These 5 elements, are illusory elements. They're always changing. Your body's made up of the earth, fire, water, and air elements, which are impermanent. They have no kind of permanent stability, immutability, as you can witness through the daily life here at Amaravati, how the mind changes according to conditions. Wanting to become enlightened is certainly a desirable or admirable desire. So Bhavadana can be very noble, to save the world, to make everything fair and just and solve all the world's problems is certainly very altruistic and noble kind of thinking. But on a personal level, what are you doing? You're creating, you're not examining, investigating reality as you experience. You're trying to create imagined states of perfection that can never possibly happen. So we can live in what they call a bubble, an ideal world that we create with our imagination. But and this happens in monasteries. We can become disillusioned in monasteries because we can see so many things wrong with them. Because the thinking mind is a critical mind. Is Amaravati a perfect monastery where everybody is enlightened? And we might naively believe that in the beginning, but as you live here, you see that there's all kinds of imperfections. So one can be disillusioned with religion, with meditation, because we're creating the desire to become perfect with the basic delusion of the personality becoming perfect. When the witnessing, sati sampajanya, the witnessing of the personality is very unstable in all of us. Just watching throughout a day, living in my kuti here at Amaravati, my personality changes according to conditions. Still does after all these years of meditation, because that's the nature of the personality. But you realize you're not a person, you're not a personality, you're not a body. So you let go, which doesn't mean you destroy, it means you relax, you become the Buddha observing the Dhamma, the Bhutto, the witness to the way it is. And the way it is all conditions are impermanent. And they are. When you don't believe me, I expect you to investigate this for yourself. So that's bhavana, meditation. Investigate, are there conditions that are permanent? Is Mount Everest permanent, or the Rock of Gibraltar, are they permanent? And in terms of our physical form, identify with the physical body, then Rock of Gibraltar seems permanent. But it is a form made of earth, fire, water, and air. Or Mount Everest is a form. The Himalayan mountains are forms. The United Kingdom is form. Our mothers and fathers, grandparents, everything is form, has a form of that we approve of or disapprove of, like or dislike. But with mindfulness as your refuge, awareness as your refuge, you begin to realize you're not what you think or believe. that you are the Dhamma itself, ultimate reality. This is your real nature, the deathless reality. Absolute reality is not something in the distant future, but this is what the Buddha awakened to under the Bodhi tree when he realized enlightenment, that he's not the form, he's not Gautama the Buddha or anything else, he's not anything. And so after his enlightenment, because there are no words for Dhamma, it's beyond language. And the words he did use, just to the ascetic that we claim to be the all-enlightened Buddha, they were words, and the ascetic wasn't prepared to understand that kind of language coming from a form, and the ascetic, no doubt, identified with his own form, and to most of us that sounds overestimation. Somebody claims to be the perfect Buddha, enlightened Buddha. So when the Buddha met his friends in Sarnath, he pointed to the fact that we investigate is there is suffering. And to understand suffering, to realize suffering is like this: wanting something you don't have, or wanting to get rid of something you have that you don't want. So the three kinds of desire is Gamadana, sensual desire; Bhavadana, desire to get something you don't have; Vipavadana, the third kind, desire to get rid of it, something you don't want and don't like. And I realized how much of my life, being quite an idealistic person throughout my life, I tend towards idealism as my conditioning, my karmic conditioning tends towards idealism, wanting to get rid. Like I took the vows of celibacy to get rid of sexual desire. That was my personal approach at the time I ordained as a monk, to transcend the sensual desires, to transcend as a person of getting above the sensory desires, which is a kind of noble-hearted person, but is based on the basic delusion that I am the person. So in investigation, you realize you're not the person you believe in. You're not a person at all. That's an illusion. There is the form of the physical body, it's like this, it has eyes, ears, nose, tongue, has a brain. It's about pleasure, pain experiences, about right and wrong, good and bad. And that's the world we believe is the real world, is very judgmental, opinionated, full of views, concepts that one clings to, good or bad concepts. But that very clinging is the basic cause of suffering, clinging to forms, clinging to delusions, clinging to life as a person, clinging to ideals as some kind of personal image. When you let go of everything, now the insight into Bhavadana is to let go. It's about letting go of it, or not getting rid of it. It's not about having no desires anymore, or getting rid of it or annihilating it, but knowing it. Desire is this realm that we're experiencing. It's a desire realm. It's the way it is. But that which is aware of desire is not desire. So mindfulness, when the Buddha emphasized sati sampajanya, or mindfulness, awareness, isn't something personal. It's the gift that we have as human beings to reflect on the impermanence of experience that we have through the body and the senses, and no longer hold on to those out of delusion, out of ignorance, hold on to these delusions we've been conditioned by, to not deny the delusions, but to know delusion is like this, it's impermanent. So this leads to Nirodha, third noble truth, which is the end of suffering. And with the end of suffering, there's samadhi, right understanding. It's the eightfold path. Remember, it's eightfold, it's not 8 steps. So right understanding, samadhi, the rest fall in line with that in terms of our life as human beings on planet Earth till the body expires or the earth disappears. Is samadhi, samasang, our intentions, our speech, action, livelihood, our concentration, mindfulness concentration, and this is our reality, is that these continue, like the Buddha lived to 80 years old, a physical form. So you don't get rid of things out of a desire to annihilate, but to understand that vipavadana, desire to get rid of things, is a sankhara. You can witness to it. It comes and goes according to conditions. So these Four Noble Truths I recommend as a guide for your life, because this very profound teaching is simple enough. It's not like a complicated form of Buddhism. You have to get this before you get that. It's, you know, there is suffering is a kind of direct approach. It's not that you have to get samadhi before you can witness suffering. That's still words that you might believe in or hear from a teacher or read from a book. But suffering is just an experience of here and now that you witness to. So there's Buddha and there's Dhamma. It's Buddha that knows the Dhamma. Sangha is samadhi, the Eightfold Path. So I offer this as a reflection.